We found that there was a gap in the market that we wanted to go and work at, which is helping these sellers and these founders have a great exit to a company that cares about the employees. And with EquityX, we created an employee ownership model where we get these legacy businesses. We care about the legacy of the founder and we care about the employees that work there. And that's kind of what brought us to build EquityX.
Welcome to the latest episode of Raise&Exit, where we set up founders to know and have information that they need months, often years in advance of the actual moment. Today we have with us Neal Cobb from EquityX, and he's bringing what I think is a very fascinating way of exiting a business, especially if you truly care about the employees that helped you get to where you are in the moment. So on that note, Neal, over to you. Please introduce yourself, your organization, and a bit of the thesis that allowed you to put EquityX together so that our listeners or viewers are able to kind of see, do they see themselves possibly exiting through you?
No, perfect. I appreciate you having me on, Edgar. So yeah, kind of a brief intro of myself. I'm a multi-exited founder, a chiropractor turned tech entrepreneur, sold a tech delivery business called Skip Cart back in 2021 to 7-Eleven, and really, made some good money with my original exit back in the day, but wanted to build a company that actually made more of an impact outside of just my pocketbook, right? And sat there for a couple of years working with 7-Eleven, trying to kind of build out the thesis of where I wanted to go next. And my previous co-founder, Ben Jones, him and I took a little road trip, and we were talking about his father, who built a 20-year-old business, had a drilling business within the family for a long period of time, had a heart condition, and within, matter of months, ended up having to shut down a family-owned business and didn't have a great exit strategy, right? And we realized, this silver tsunami you hear about was a real thing. Like that you have a very large population of individuals that own majority of your small to mid-cap businesses, and they don't have a great exit. There's not a lot of buyers out there that really fit the right type of mold for some of these businesses. And once you get to a certain size business too, really your only option is private equity. And most of private equity, they come in there, they want to squeeze the business, they want to make the profits off of it, and then spin it off in 5 years, whatever it might be, and make max profits and get the max return for their investors. But they don't care as much about the business. They don't care much about the brand or the employees. And that was kind of growing up a small town kid with my dad who had his own small business. It didn't sit well with me, and we found that there was a gap in the market that we wanted to go and work at, which is helping these sellers and these founders have a great exit to a company that cares about the employees. And with EquityX, we created an employee ownership model where we get these legacy businesses. We care about the legacy of the founder and we care about the employees that work there. And that's kind of what brought us to build EquityX.
I think that is really interesting because I think a lot of people are more familiar with employee ownership in the more traditional venture capital domain. You go and get those early employees in, they get some vested stock options. If they were early enough, they might actually go and get a wealth event for themselves if it's a big enough exit. What you're actually talking about is almost like I wouldn't call it the polar opposite, but call it the other end of it, which is the business has actually become successful. The employees that have been part of that success get to be part of it. And maybe you can just kind of unpack a bit more, like what are these industries where you're seeing this type of model being relevant? Part of it is a plug for you to go and possibly have folks coming to you to go and make an acquisition. But I would assert that this approach may not work for all businesses. So where do you see this working in America?
Our focus is primarily manufacturing construction. Your second generation, these individuals that own these companies, they're kids that are my age. They don't typically look at manufacturing or construction as a sexy business, right? They see AI, they see tech, they see sales, whatever it might be. And so previously in the past history, you didn't have a problem passing down a manufacturing business to your kid. Nowadays, you don't have a great exit for that. And where we really see employee ownership working is it needs to be a type of business and a type of industry that has enough employees where it makes sense. Like we're not trying to buy a 5 or 10 employee company. We're looking at 50 to 150 employees in a business, where you can make a difference and do it at scale, where it's a large enough business where these employees can vest stock over a period of time, and then we start doing profit sharing in the future, as well as when they decide to retire one day, whatever they vested, we can buy the stocks back from them, and they essentially get a little golden parachute, where before that they might maybe not have owned a stock in their life or a part
Yeah.
of anything in their life, probably rent the house that they live in, outside of their car. They don't really have any true assets, and so it's giving back to the people that have helped build this business, and a lot of them have been there for 15 plus years. These employees, they're faithful and loyal. They just, now you can get them to get a little skin in the game.
I love what you say there, and there's also something that you said when you're describing, what you're doing and why you're doing it, which I don't hear nearly enough, which is around the fact that these small, medium-sized businesses, they actually have brands, right? Like they have either a presence in the community or they have a niche presence in their industry. A lot of these manufacturing companies, they could be manufacturing under license. They could be going and providing some kind of a service or high precision instrumentation, whatever the heck it may be. Can you unpack a little bit more of that notion of continuing what's already working? Because, it sounds like you're looking at like 10 plus year time frames of business continuity versus the more traditional 3 to 7 year squeeze that private equity has. So are you buying and holding? Are you rolling up? Are you trying to buy and scale? Give me a sense of like what is the ultimate end game here that is facilitating success for people who sell to somebody like you.
Yeah, so our strategy is a long-term hold, more like an evergreen approach, where we're going in and we're trying to stay within certain lanes so that we can buy companies that have synergies between the two of them. So buying manufacturing within certain realms, where we can buy something that has similar types of business, where also, as we're building out back end services, we're actually kind of building a neobank on the back end of our companies, where
Yeah.
we can do credit cards, banking, insurance, all these different things. Well, the more specific you can go, as well as with back office services, then you can use the knowledge and the know-how on that industry, because you become really built out and become a professional and the expert in that field. And so that's kind of the way we go with a lot of our businesses, is we're trying to go specific within verticals, and then at the same time build out support where they can help them scale. Because let's say our construction business, they do concrete, but we can do adjunctive services where I can go and buy a masonry company, or I can buy a landscape architect type company, where now you're going to these general contractors who would prefer to go to one contractor or subcontractor for a job, especially if they can do multiple services for them. And so we can go wider within those specific industries and just bolt on companies, or you can acquire other concrete companies in the surrounding areas and do expansion that way.
I like what you're kind of pointing to there, because I think sometimes we forget in the moment of where we are, of like, the current, sexy businesses or the current narrative of like where things come from. But you're talking about businesses that have been around probably a decade, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 decades.
Correct.
And I think it's going and adding that contemporary lens to it, right? Is that, hey, we're able to go and provide a scaling and an expertise. Because sometimes I look at like how we started this podcast series, right? And the podcast series is like, look, founders aren't in the business of raising capital, and business owners aren't in the business of selling businesses, which kind of seems like a really silly kind of notion, but it's actually very much true. Like they're in the business of making these exceptional businesses that go and serve customers, that build brands that are attractive. And what I'm hearing here is that same element that's there. It's that ethos of continuing that way, but providing that contemporary, current generational expertise of network effects, integrated back office, where you don't need to go and get 15 different controllers at 15 different companies. Maybe you're able to go and use 5, and they understand how to go and use the systems across them, because the businesses are similar enough. And it's almost like a Lego building exercise in a similar domain, rather than putty being smashed into all brown.
Yeah,
That's
no,
what I'm
100%.
hearing here.
Yeah, and one of our hard criteria is the business has to be 10 years old. If it's not 10 years
That's
old,
great.
we don't even look at the business, right?
So
We want something that's been around and proven itself. There's actually statistics that show like the success of a business, and you look from year one to almost year eight. You know, their likelihood of closing down gets less and less. But once you get after year eight, if it's made it and its mark in the community and built the brand to that point, usually the risk of it shutting down are much less after that point.
So I want to pivot then to what is the due diligence in situations like this, right? There's different types of due diligence that organizations need to be prepared for. And this is not to kind of diminish or adjust the due diligence requirements of different transaction structures. But if somebody does want to sell through this type of structure, what is something that they need to prepare for from financial terms, their confidential information memorandum, that another organization may not? Like, what are you looking for, or what would you encourage people exploring this type of exit prepare so that it makes it a win-win-win for the seller, the buyer, and the employees that are going to come out on the other side with equity as well?
Sure. So I'll kind of start with what we look for in a business and how we go and look at a sim from a seller. And we get the sim from the broker, we sign the NDA, we look through the financials, and we've talked to enough businesses as well as enough banks where we know exactly what the bank wants to finance a deal. And if you have a searcher that doesn't understand all the different criteria on what it needs to actually get it financed, it's all well and good to sit there and come out and like, oh, I'll give you 5x for your business, or 10x, whatever that number might be. But if you can't actually get it financed and you don't have the cash for it, like, what the hell's the point? And you're just wasting that individual's time. So what we've built out is we actually have an AI software. I'm from Texas. Our team built out these AI things. One's called Rope and one's called Cowboy. But we have one that's a scraper that scrapes the internet and finds deals for us that go within the criteria that we're looking for. And then once we get the information, we actually say, like, hey, what is the debt service coverage ratio for this business? What is the debt to equity ratios? What's the quick and acid test ratios? We look at all these different things that the bank is going to ask us for, and we make sure, is it a financeable deal? And I'll kind of go back to one of our first LOIs when we first got going last July in 24. Loved the business. We put an offer out. Seller said, hey, yeah, like, I think you're in the ballpark. Come check out our place. And he had a tile business. And so we went over there. We flew to go talk to him. Well, they didn't have a price online. Well, we put about a 3.5x multiple on the EBITDA, which was par for the course for the industry. And then he comes and gives us a 6.5x number on top of it. It's like, we're not even anywhere in the same ballpark, right? It's double what we were asking. And so I would say, from a seller standpoint, know your industry, know the broker that you're working with that can sit there and guide you along in this process, and make sure you're not creating a fantasy of what you think your business is valued at, and it's actually relevant to the market. Because, and I've seen brokers do this, and this is something the seller needs to watch out for. They'll pay 20 or 50 grand up front to go and put the sim together. They're already getting paid that 20 or 50 grand, regardless if they sell your business. And so that you sit there and say, oh, I want to sell it for 20 million. And, oh, great, yeah, we can do that. Well, it might only be a 10 million business or 12 million. And so now you've created this reality with the seller, and it's very hard to bring them back to what the true reality of this business and how to find the right buyer for it. And so from a seller side, find the right counsel and group and broker that is seasoned and understand the industry, and they'll help guide you through this process. I would say trying to go and do it on your own probably is very tough on the buyer side.
I think, Neal, you just gone and unpacked a bunch of things. You also preempted one of my questions, which is great. So I have one last question to ask you. But you did kind of get into what I think is just kind of, call it like the boring, the messy, I don't want to think about it until I have to, which is what I kind of call a self due diligence on yourself. And I think that there's two things that I'm a huge proponent of. Okay, one, don't ever compare yourself to the highest transaction price in the industry. Right? Unless you have people like trying to break down your door. And the second one, don't ever look at the average transaction value in your industry, because maybe 1 to 2% of deals ever close at the average. Everybody else is at a range, right? So what you just pointed to right there is I think there's a difference between am I sellable versus I'm acquirable. And I think what you're pointing to is how are companies in my industry acquired? And am I able to set myself up for that? Now, you also went and talked about the debt side of it, right? I think there's too many people forget that, look, an all cash deal is actually extremely rare. They get too much coverage in the business media because you go and hear a large public company saying, "Oh, it's a $135 million all cash deal." It's like, yeah, well, they're sitting on like 15 billion in cash. Like, there's a rounding error for them, right? But most of the time, even in venture, even in private equity, there's some form of debt involved. Now, what I like about what you're doing is that you're already preempting your debt due diligence. Like, I've worked with companies where I'm like, "Hey, look, you're about to be acquired by this company. I'm warning you, you're going to go through a second round of due diligence through the lender. Like, this deal's not finished yet, right?" So tell me a bit more about that process. What had you go into kind of like that debt due diligence early? And then what are some recommendations you would make to sellers that are in industries that are heavily acquired with debt that they should do to prepare themselves for debt level of due diligence?
Yeah, and so on the debt side, we hop in that before we even put an LOI out. We look through your financials of the seller. We make sure, what is the industry? What does your market look like? What is the growth? We look at the finances. You want something, like, we don't even look at something unless it shows a positive trend on their CAGR. If it's not, if it's up and down, and if it's a cyclical business, we try to stay away from them. But on the debt side, these lenders are conservative. And so if a buyer is coming in and trying to leverage different things, different ways, and they don't have the cash to be able to pull it off, yes, you can seller finance 40% of it, and the bank, they can say that they're in a bank finance 60%, but most banks want to see a buyer that can put 20% cash down because they want the buyer to have skin in the game. And so you need to make sure that you're finding a buyer that actually has the cash to be able to close this deal and has the banking relationships to be able to do it, because the bank is going to go in there and they look at coverage ratios. And so when you look at a coverage ratio, and from the seller standpoint, you look at, okay, I want to sell my business, I'll do round numbers, $10 million. I want to sell it for $10 million and our cash flow is $3 million. Is the debt coverage ratio, and most of the banks are usually at a 2.0 debt service ratio on senior debt. And so that means if you have $3 million in EBITDA, the bank at most will give $6 million. And so where's that other $4 million for that deal coming from? Whether it's the buyer, the seller financing, things like that. And so as you're looking at it, if the numbers that they're giving to buy your company and then what they're putting in cash don't add up to make the ratios correctly, like, they're not going to be able to finance that deal.
Yeah, and I think what I like about what you're pointing to there is I would almost kind of like add to it as like that self due diligence, which is how much would my own bank that I've had a relationship with for a long time potentially lend to us, right? And that can be a lot of bank managers or account managers will give that as a courtesy, especially if you have that transition planning. Now, I do want to go to the transition planning side because as you're a big part is like, when do you know that you're ready to sell is one question. The second thing is, how long does it actually take to sell? I go back to the extremities. You either go in here, this deal closed super fast, right? And people like they love speed, etc. Or this deal, took forever. But like, what's a responsible self-assessment that a seller should go through in like, how long does it take? And how do you set yourself up for one of my favorite terms, deal fatigue?
Yeah. No, it's a real thing. Both deals that we've closed, from when we start the conversations to when we close a transaction, is like 6 to 8 months, right? And so that was in conversations, working on trying to figure out the LOI. We didn't jump into anything super fast, but once you also get an LOI signed, then they have to do their diligence phase. That's going to take, let's call it 4 weeks. And then they got to go get your term sheet. Once they get the term sheet from a bank, then that's when your real kind of timeline starts from a buyer side. They have 90 days to close after they get a term sheet from a bank. But first they got to get the term sheet. So up to that point, from what I understand from brokers and sellers I've talked to, is it takes around 60 to 90 days, depending on the broker, sometimes 30, for a broker to get all your information. And it all depends on the seller on, are you actually giving your broker all the information when he's asking for it, so he can put this whole 50-page document together and then bring it to market. And so then now you got 3 months to bring it to market, and then you bring it to market and you're going to get offers. And let's call it over the next 3 to 4, 5 months, you're going to be getting offers. You got to decide which is the right offer for you. And then even once you get the offer and you accept it, now you have this other phase of another 4 to 5 months to get that thing closed. And so I would say most deals is probably 12 to 18 months just from when you get it started to when it closed. You got to realize, if you pick the wrong buyer, that thing could fall through, and it can fall through at the last minute. We almost had a deal fall through ourselves. And so there's a lot of work in between that, and things can fall through, and it's not an LOI is not a closed deal. You got to get the financing from the bank. That's part two of it as well.
I love that so much. Just one of the other folks that we're interviewing is like, look, like there's an engagement and there's a marriage, and if you're engaged too long, right, that has its own kind of consequences that is there. I want to kind of take you actually back to your own experience in going through transactions. I think something that is very difficult for people to imagine, and really kind of comes through like experiential exposure, is what it is like to run a business while trying to sell a business at the same time. So given your experience in this, and now you being on the other side that you're trying to do the acquisitions, how do you prepare yourself as a business owner or a founder, or like what can help your sanity? What recommendations would you go and make to business owners of like, hey, you've been full-time or more than full-time building and running this business. We're just going to go and add a lot more to your plate for the next 12 to 18 months. How do you prepare for that? What are some tips that you would go and put to make it easier?
It takes grit, right? Because running a business is tough enough. And so I had a delivery technology business called Skipcart that's similar to DoorDash, but it was a white label third-party delivery company. Built it during COVID, or actually prior to COVID. COVID took off. We built it for 3 years. We raised just shy of $24 million in scaling it up.
Yep.
And we came to a point of, okay, do we keep raising money or do we sell? And at that point, we needed to go raise $100 million to really be relevant and continue to grow. And so we said, okay, let's find the right partner to sell. Well, we also chose that point even before we did our Series A. And we had this deal kept going through, and it kind of got drug along. From a startup standpoint, we actually were burning through our cash. And we had to say, either we raise money, or if this deal doesn't go through, we're going to be out of cash and we're going to die as a company. And so that's
that is a danger, by the way. There's a lot of founders or business owners that discover that they lose their eye on the ball as they're selling. And I would say even for these 10-plus-year-old companies that you're running, like it's a fire hose of information that you have to go through because you haven't designed your business to be sellable. So what else would you kind of put as a recommendation?
Yeah, most people don't think about selling their business. Your typical founder that's, in his, let's call it his 60s by the time that thought even gets into your head. And by the time you actually start getting ready for that, let's call it late 60s or 70s, what you don't want is now you've already started letting the business decline for the last couple years because you've started getting worn out. And by the time you finally realize I should sell this, well, now you're getting less for that business than you could have 3 or 4 years ago when you were still churning and burning and cranking away. And so it's definitely something where it fatigues you. It wears you down as a seller because there's highs and lows in these deals, and you're having to sit there and negotiate and fight through things, and you got to keep your business running at the same time. And that's where you hope you've trained a great team that can keep it going when you're not fully focused anymore. And being on that side of the deal, now I'm purchasing businesses, and one of our deals, my other co-founders were like, oh, he's trying to play games with us. And I said, no. I said, that's emotion. And I said, I've been there. I said, it's very emotional when you've built a business from ground up. You care for these employees. You care for your brand. And you're just scared that, am I making the right decision? Am I picking the right partner to take over my business? And it's very emotional from the selling side. Are you making the right choice? And what I would say is, make sure you're ready to sell. Make sure you go and do your proper diligence of, hey, how do I want this transaction to work? And just kind of mentally prepare your mind of, I'm giving over control. Because most of these owners, like, you care about control and you've had it for so long. It's no longer going to be your baby anymore. You just got to find the right partner that you can trust, and then you got to start kind of handing over those reins.
So I want to build on that a little bit more, which is like operationally, what can these business owners do? Like, is it like how would you kind of put, I call it operational succession planning into your organization? What are some recommendations you'd have on, because it sounds to me like you almost want to have somebody who's been primed to take over versus, oh man, like this person might just get up and go 6 months after the deal closes. So tell me a bit more about how can you prime yourself better for this type of exit where, you want to walk into the sunset, but get your company to be successful behind you, after you.
I think there's two key ones that at least I look for from a seller side or a buyer side. One is, what do the finances look like? And so most business owners, like, they're not finance specialists, right? And they don't necessarily have somebody on their accounting side that has buttoned everything up. And so if it's a mess and you're sitting there playing with money and you have this, you're moving stuff around, your discretionary funds and what you're taking from the business and how you're spending things is more like a business owner rather than a true business.
Yep.
It's also tougher for banks to go and finance it because they're like, okay, your discretionary earnings and what they're taking and doing with the business and all these side things that they're pulling in and out all the time, that's above 20% of what their take home is. And so the banks don't like that either, right? And if your ad backs are more than 20%, it's not a good thing. And so you need to start prepping this business like somebody else owns it. Let that business kind of grow up. Make sure the finances are in order where you're doing proper P&Ls, you have a clean balance sheet. The less debt you have on the company is actually a good thing. And so I would say really get your finances in order and start preparing that. And that's a couple years in advance. Like, you need to do this for a couple years of some clean books going in that right direction where they can walk in and it's clean versus they walk in and they're like, what skeletons am I going to find in the closet because these finances are already a mess. Yeah. And a good buyer is going to see that quickly. And then second, I would say in terms of transitioning is build a management team in place. Like, if you want to step away sooner than later, you better have a management team that can run that. Because if this is a one-man show where you're doing all the different things across the board and it's horizontal and you're over every aspect of the business, then when your knowledge goes out the door, like, who's taking that over? And so if you can build processes operationally in place and you have people that run sections of the business that have this knowledge and you build their knowledge up, not only is that going to help for a buyer, it's going to help your business. Even if you can't sell right off the bat, now you've trained your team to be accountable and take accountability on their own to own their section of the business. A buyer is going to come in and say, like, this is great. Because if we see a business that doesn't have two or more like really high level managers, we don't even look at it.
I love what you say. And I think what you're kind of getting to is, which is an interesting thing. People are thinking that buyers are sometimes trying to get companies for the lowest price. I don't think so. I think they're trying to get them for the lowest risk. And from everything that I'm hearing from you, you're willing to pay a premium if the risk is sufficiently reduced to justify the capital exposure, the debt exposure that's there. Neal, this has been really valuable. And I just love how you're kind of like introducing our viewers and listeners to an exit pathway that might align much more with their personal values of bringing their team along in financial success. Thank you for joining us today and look forward to the next time.
Yeah, for sure. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. Cheers. My session with Neal Cobb brought a great perspective on how to go and just take a look at the whole thing of raising capital or selling your company or going and finding a joint venture partner, whatever the heck it may be. And I think the piece that I thought was really, really good was that you want to go and look at what brings the lowest risk for the type of return. Not necessarily the lowest valuation or greatest share of equity or whatever the heck it may be, But I think he pointed to is what is often there in the background and is not necessarily having the express language used by the investor or the acquirer in any transaction, which is this going to provide the greatest return for the lowest risk? And this is the risk-reward ratio, not the risk to valuation or the valuation to ownership ratio, whatever the heck it may be. And I think you want to be able to unpack that, especially if you are unclear as to why you're going to have people walking away from you when you think that there's a deal on the table. Maybe there's something there to the risk that you haven't gotten figured out. And the best way to be able to go and handle this is to go and start de-risking yourself in the future. This is a big part of what I get to do with our clients on a day-to-day basis, is helping them be able to figure out what those risks are there that they don't see because they haven't been in the business of going and acquiring other companies or investing into them. And I think that's a really big catalyst that's there. It's getting that proper, not just a 360 or 180 or whatever like you want to call it, but it's really that complete view, especially from those who have perspective and experiences that you don't and may have a different value add that they're able to go and bring. So on that note, start looking at yourself not just from the point of view of how valuable your company is, but what are the risk mitigating factors that are there. And I want to emphasize at the end, in that conversation with Neal and from the conversations I've had throughout my career, it's not that you want to get to no risk, it's that you go and get to a qualified risk. And a qualified risk that people are saying, I think that this is a risk worth taking for the reward that's on the other side, and it has been as mitigated as much as possible, regardless of the level of risk that is there. So hope this is another episode of Raise and Exit that gives you some value and perspective to go and take as you go to seek and raise money, sell your business, or scale your business, whatever it may be. Till next time.